Hello and welcome to this special bonus edition of Consciousness Central, coming from the Science of Consciousness Conference 2017 in San Diego. I'm your host, Nick Day, and in this program we feature highlights of my interviews with some of the leading minds in the field of consciousness research, including world-renowned neuroscientist and author V.S. Ramachandran, NASA scientist and pioneer in evolutionary theory Bruce Damer, and Professor of Linguistics at the University of Arizona, Thomas Bever. But first, it was my great honor to sit down with two remarkable women who are here to talk about their work with the Consciousness Healing Initiative. The co-founder of CHI, Shamini Jain, and CASSANDRA VIETEN, president of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And you can find my full interview with Shamini and Cassie on this channel by following this link on your screen. So I'd like to welcome to Consciousness Central Cassie VIETEN, who is president of the Institute of Noetic Sciences in Petaluma, and Shamini Jain, who is founder of the Consciousness and Healing Initiative and is an assistant professor at UC San Diego. Cassie and Shamini, welcome to Consciousness Central.
Thank you.
A delight to see you both. So tell me something about you. You gave a workshop at the beginning of the week on the Consciousness and Healing Initiative. What is that?
Well, the Consciousness and Healing Initiative is a collaborative accelerator to forward the science and practice of healing, and IONS is a key partner. Cassie is actually a founding advisor of the initiative, and it really began kind of organically because a number of us were getting together and exploring these areas of frontier aspects of consciousness and how they intersect with the healing process. And what we learned as we began dialoguing is, we all have certain sets of skills, talents, and there was the great need to scientists in the area who were really interested in these frontier areas of research. Now, of course, as you know, IONS is a leader in that field. But we became aware of other scientists as well in major universities, tenured professors, other places who, were very successful, for example, in getting NIH funding for their more mainstream work. But they had these closet interests, if you will, and some of them not even closet, in areas of consciousness and healing, including biofield science, exploring spirituality and consciousness, in more frontier ways. So we all really got together with a number of different organizations, IONS, the Chopra Foundation, Miraglow Foundation, at the time Samueli Institute, and others, and we said, what can we do if we come together and collaborate to really forward this? And so that's how the initiative was born. So the workshop that we did was really nice because it was multidisciplinary, which I think is a key a key focus of the initiative, and IONS is another example of how multidisciplinary science and practice can flourish. We, during the workshop, we explored these areas of biofield science and frontier aspects of consciousness from scientific perspectives, practice perspectives, and technology perspectives. And we, explored what it means to feel that. What does that mean experientially? How does it integrate into my daily life? So these are some of the areas we explored together.
Excellent. So Cassie, you're coming from IONS. That sounds right up your street. Tell us how this all got started.
Yeah, well, IONS for a very long time has been a leader in mind-body medicine, and IONS funded the first studies on meditation, for example, and the health benefits with Herb Benson at Harvard, and was key in starting the field of psychoneuroimmunology by hosting several meetings with psychologists, immunologists, and biologists who hadn't been speaking before, brain scientists who hadn't been really talking to each other prior to that. And then also has been a pioneer in concepts around distant healing or energy healing, and whether there's some way to investigate those scientifically. And so over the years we've made a lot of strides forward, but what we've noticed, like Shamini was saying, is that there are all these relatively small groups all over the world who are making incremental progress with really not enough funding to do these tiny studies with small sample sizes and not always adequate controls and all of this stuff. Still making progress and kind of fighting the good fight and being courageous despite a lot of backlash from the conventional medical community. So we thought that we could leverage our scientists and our educators by joining with the Consciousness and Healing Initiative, so that the idea being that if we all work together, we might make a bigger impact than if we all work separately.
Can you talk about some of the, what would you say, are they called modalities or techniques, or what actually would be the substance of the initiative?
So I think the question is, what have we been up to for the last few years, and what do we know about these studies of frontier aspects of consciousness and healing? Well, one of the areas that we've been focused on for the last several years has been in this area of biofield science, which is the study of energy and information as it applies to health, essentially. We can use fancier terms, but that's essentially it. And here's what we know so far. You've already heard a lot of talks probably at the conference this year on things like non-invasive brain stimulation, right? The use of bioelectricity, essentially, use electricity and magnetism to work with the body to facilitate some kind of a response in the body, right? That's one aspect of biofield science. And then there are these others that we call biofield therapies, which are things like Reiki, healing touch, and therapeutic touch, that make us begin to question, can we explain the intersection of consciousness and healing in purely physicalist terms, right? So the study of things like biofield therapies in conjunction with some of these more electromagnetic aspects of biofield science really help us to, one, explore what do we really know about consciousness and its relevance in terms of the health process? Do we need to evolve our models of the body and how they work? Is there an intersection between some of the ancient knowledge that has been put forth in systems like Ayurveda and Chinese medicine? Can we understand those from a biofield science perspective, and what does the data say? So in a nutshell, I won't bore you with summarizing all the data for biofield science, but I'll say that, we've really taken a multidisciplinary approach to that. And one of the first things that we did as a group was we held a meeting in biofield science where we brought together healers, we brought together medical professionals, MDs, nurses, others. We brought together physicists, psychoneuroimmunologists, biophysicists to really explore this area in detail. What does the data say? And an outcome of that was a publication called Biofield Science and Healing, which is a peer-reviewed publication, a special issue that's published in Global Advances Health and Medicine, which is freely available to everyone and can be accessed through our website, which is www.chi.is. So that's part of what we've been doing, and we explored those areas today and during the conference.
Is there anything you'd like to say that people need to know? This is a good opportunity perhaps for our audience to find out more and how they do that, and if they want to get involved or just get information, what do they do?
Go ahead.
I would invite you all to join Chi, to check out our website and find amazing resources there for your own healing and your edification. The website is www.chi, Chi or Consciousness and Healing Initiative.is. So www.chi.is.
Yeah, and I would say people can go to the Institute of Noetic Sciences website, which is noetic.org. And we also have an online library there that is about 20 of these consciousness and healing or energy medicine modalities, where we've done a 2 or 3 page review of the literature where you can find articles about it. And just to say, I think it's long beyond time that we begin to train the lens of science seriously on consciousness and how it might influence the physical world, starting with our own physical bodies and the people that we're with.
Shamini and Cassie, thank you. Always a delight to see you.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks
today.
so much, Nick.
All right. That's Cassie Vieten and Shamini Jain.
Anirban, we're familiar with your microtubules research, but now you've got a model. Tell us what's going on here.
Yeah, so this is a tubulin protein.
That's a model of the tubulin protein?
Yes, so this is created by the son of G.D. Pokorny, Jain Pokorny. So we have 15% of our body is made of this particular protein. So if we go in the brain, majority of the protein is this. This is the unit of here. So this is microtubule. Each capacitor actually represents the entire structure. So inside a neuron, we have this kind of nanowires. So we have built 2 of them. One lattice is here, another lattice is here. What we are doing, we are pumping noise. And what is this system? This system is like this. Okay, so this is just like this. So we have capacitors soldered in a ring. But we follow the exact topology that is there in the biological system. The distance between these two and distance between these two, if we take a ratio, it is 1.03 in every single protein in the living plants, in life forms, everywhere. So we have followed that exactly, and we have created two lattices. We have pumped noise, and it generates organized signal in the megahertz domain here.
So by building a scale model of the tubulin and the microtubule, then by pumping sort of noise into it, you're showing that, like what happens in biology, that the system can use noise to produce sort of organized behavior.
Yes.
Awesome.
So it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome to Consciousness Central Dr. V.S. Ramachandran, Distinguished Professor at UCSD, acclaimed and renowned neuroscientist. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here.
Thank you for coming. And can you just give us an outline sketch of your work and how it relates to consciousness studies here?
Well, part one is easy, outline sketch of my work. Part two, about relating it to consciousness, is a tough one. In terms of consciousness, the word is used in many different ways, as you know. Mind, consciousness, qualia, self-awareness, sense of self. And I think there's confounding two problems here. One problem is what I call the vantage point problem, first proposed in the Upanishads in the second millennium BC, and then revived by Erwin Schrödinger, the great physicist. That refers to the fact that in physics and in science, you have a third-person description of the world, an objective description of events in the so-called real world out there. And the first-person singular, I, does not exist in physics. There are billions of brains, all of which are viewing the world, of which I am one. I have no privileged status. I'm not looking at the world through windows and illuminating this corner of the world. All that doesn't exist in physics. But we know it's true. It's axiomatic that I exist and I open my eyes and see the world. And the consciousness illuminates this corner of the world, not some other corner of the world. So this fundamental asymmetry in nature between the third-person description of the world, which does not include the pronoun I, it doesn't exist. This is not verbal gymnastics. I'm saying it just doesn't exist in physics, right? Whereas from my personal point of view, that's all that exists. The world I became aware of the world when I was born, and it was going to disappear, for all I know. So this asymmetry is fundamental to understanding consciousness, but that's loosely analogous to what Chalmers calls the heart problem. And that, I think, is not going to be tackled by empirical neuroscience, doing clinical work on patients, or by doing cellular neurophysiology. It may require a complete upheaval in our view of the cosmos, of the kind that Einstein did for relativity or quantum mechanics. You need a completely different conception of the cosmos, integrating the mind into it. This is what people like Roger Penrose have suggested. You need a new physics, in other words, because physics, science as it stands now, does not include the first person. Therefore, you can't explain the first person and qualia, but qualia also arises in the first person singular. I mean, I see it red. I don't know anyone of you here can see that thing, that color which I'm seeing. I just guess that you are, I infer that you are by analogy, but I don't know for sure, whereas I'm sure indubitably that I'm seeing that red. That question does not arise in science because I don't exist in science. The pronoun I doesn't exist. Therefore, you can't use science to explain qualia. It's a misguided enterprise. You need to change science in some way, which we don't understand, have a new science, and that in turn might encompass qualia. So that's one view. The thing I'm interested in is looking at disturbances of qualia, changes in mind, changes in behavior that occur when different parts of the brain are damaged. There's a small lesion, you get not a complete across-the-board reduction in all your mental capacities, a blunting of your cognition, or blunting of your consciousness. What you see is a specific loss of a highly selective change in your behavior or mind, which gives you some confidence in asserting that region of the brain is involved in that function. Much better than brain imaging, I can tell you that. Because with brain lesions, you know that part is critical for that function. And in a sense, you're more confident of that assertion than you can be with any other approach to the brain, functions of the brain. Many examples I discussed yesterday, and we talked about body image disturbances. So you can take the characteristics of the self, like many people have done, Dan Dennett, many others. When you introspect, what are the characteristics of the self? There's the self that has embodied, it's anchored in here in this body. If you say, I'm in your body, that doesn't make any sense. It's almost axiomatic foundation of yourself. But with a few tricks, I can make that malleable and put myself somewhere else. I'll get to that in a minute. Then there is a notion of continuity in time. I see myself as a person, continuous in time. the timeline being punctuated by poignant memories and episodes. You can get in mental time travel, going to and fro. This sense of continuity in time, past, present, future, is also very much a part of yourself, construction of self. Then unity of conscious experience, you get diversity of sensory expressions, person sitting there, all of this paraphernalia here. I'm at a conference and I've got memories of a lifetime. But you don't feel like you're many people, you feel like one person. This is a quasi-metaphysical, quasi-philosophical question. Why do I feel like one person? We won't go into that because again it gets you into philosophy, which is not my province. Why do I feel like one person even though I have two half brains and diversity of sense impressions, many brain modules signaling information in parallel? I don't know. But I can take one of these attributes of self, like embodiment, sense of agency, of free will. I did this. He didn't do it. I did it. But if you have an epileptic seizure, then it does that and says, it did it, I didn't do it. So somewhere in the brain, some magic line has to be crossed where you start saying it did it versus I did it. What is that magic line? What defines it? Is it semantic links? Is it, what is it exactly? That's a tractable problem, I think. We can get to it in using experimental work. Then there is, well, there's of course reflexive self-awareness. That's one attribute of self which is the most important and yet most elusive. I know I am me. I'm here and now. Here, now, me. That question of existence, personal existence, this place, this time. Where does that come from? And sense of introspective, the recursiveness of self. Where does that come from? We don't know, but again, I think the way is paved. You can make some progress looking at patients who have lost the sense of self, disturbances in the sense of self. Okay, so you get disturbances in self. For example, patient with mild dementia, with Alzheimer's, perfectly in the early stages, so she's quite, not intelligent, but she's leads a relatively normal life. But one thing is she's terrified of mirrors. She looks at a mirror on the wall. That woman is pursuing me everywhere. And anytime I go to a mirror, that woman looks towards me, and she's scary. And who is this woman? Paranoid about mirror reflections of herself. So then she said, I want to close all the shiny surfaces in the house, cover them up. I don't want to confront them. She calls it mirror phobia. It's been described before by others, Goldberg and various others, and we're trying to revive the interest in it. One of the things we found in mirror phobia is, if you take a normal person asleep and you put an ink splotch on his forehead, he gets up, he looks in the mirror, wipes out the ink splotch, goes to the bathroom, washes it off. He knows that the mirror thing is me. Some form of consciousness must be involved, or self-awareness must be involved. Exactly what it is, we don't know. But it implies something, right? So he's recognizing that that person is me. Therefore, I should remove the splotch here. He doesn't go to the mirror and try to remove the splotch. He does it here. Now, that's called the Gallup test. He said, what do you do the Gallup test on the woman who says that mirror image is an alien person? Put a splotch here, and she looks in the mirror. When she's asleep, you put a splotch, and she looks in the mirror. If she thinks that somebody else is pursuing her, she shouldn't do this. But instantly, she goes and does that. She looks in the mirror and does that. Right? Showing that the Gallup test is not valid. He's the person, she's denying that the mirror image is herself, and yet when you put a splotch, she does this. Or it's not, doesn't, even though it's valid, it's only partially valid. It doesn't apply to a situation like the one I'm telling you about, where at some level she has knowledge that the mirror image is self. Otherwise, she wouldn't do this. So the self exists in multiple layers, is the point I'm trying to make. Palimpsest of multiple layers. You can peel off each layer and study it and find out how they're all put together to constitute your sense of being a person, a human being, walking and navigating the world and doing things in the world.
A few years ago I studied and trained in hypnosis, and one of the amazing things, part of the training materials, were clips of people who had been in, either people who would go under surgery without anesthesia, or people who could be hypnotized into not feeling pain, or hypnotized into almost anything. I mean, quite remarkable. And that's just somebody talking. It's in this case, an auditory stimulation. And what you've been describing has been visual, of course. So some kind of stimuli coming from that disturbs the normal pattern seems to be capable of remarkable results, and that's what you're discovering.
Yeah, but the devil's in the details, though. You can't listen to the music and say my phantom limb pain will go away. They get irritated.
Right, exactly.
Or meditation, phantom pain goes away. They get irritated. I've tried everything. All that doesn't work. So it has to be specific to the disorder based on knowledge of brain anatomy. Not having said that, means hypnosis needs to be studied carefully because it does amazing things. We've been meaning to do that. We've never studied it. in the laboratory under proper conditions. But it does amazing things, I'm sure. And certainly lends credibility, our mirror work and work of that kind lends credibility to hypnosis.
What would you say is the placebo effect? What is that actually that's going on?
Nobody understands it. I think that it's showing that what the statement I just made was not entirely correct, that high-level beliefs can indeed affect bodily processes and unconscious brain processes, but also bodily processes in mysterious ways, affecting the threshold for pain. Whether this is a completely different brain state or just merely the power of suggestion carried to the extreme. If I tell you, bear with it, feel the pain, sometimes you can do it, but to carry it to the extreme in these people, so they're very highly suggestible. That's the cynical view. I think it's a fundamentally different brain state which we don't really understand, but needs to be studied and explored. Good question.
Excellent.
So this gives you a sample of the kinds of things we do. There's all relevance to conscious experience, not directly tackling the head-on, the philosophical problem of Schrödinger and Upanishads, the vantage point problem. How come here and me and now, looking at the world from this window, illuminated, the Minkowski space-time diagram, suddenly it was illuminated during my birth, and then it's still there, and then presumably it'll be gone after I'm dead. How come? Now, Indian philosophy claims it's an illusion, but we don't know why, how it arises. That's what we're trying to find out. So that's a metaphysical problem. You may need to change the laws of physics, different, not the laws of physics, you need new physics of the kind Penrose has embarked on to try and understand what's going on. A change in perspective, as Einstein did for relativity.
Dr. Ramachandran, thank you so much for the time for today. I have been a huge fan of your work for a long, long time. You're one of these people who's brought neuroscience into the wider population. People are interested in this in such an exciting, sort of scintillating way. We always want to know more. Thanks for being here today, and hopefully we'll see you again at Science of Consciousness in Tucson.
What's going on here?
So, my name is Tatiana Ginsberg. I'm representing project which called Russian House, and we are situated north up to San Francisco, in general in Russian River, very beautiful place. And we are a Russian spiritual community. We call ourselves School of Fifth Way and some other names. And here I am represented several things. One is the Russian puzzles. So there are some very unique things here, which is invention of one Russian guy. This puzzle, for example, the task is take out this ring, and this puzzle is to make a letter T.
So how do I take out the ring?
This is a puzzle, you think? It's.
Have you cracked it?
Yeah. The idea. What I can do. It will take some moment maybe, but for example, this puzzle, you see, it's almost impossible.
Yeah.
And a lot of people just come and see, oh, it's impossible, and they could not find out how to do it, but it's possible to do it even with the closed eyes. But you shall let me some, don't see.
And there you have it, the fifth way.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
This is possible.
Excellent.
Everything possible.
Hello, Consciousness Central. This is Nama Kostiner, and I'm presenting here about the sensation of flow that we get in creative processes. So I've been lecturing 2 times, and these are parts of my works. These are some of my interviewees, actually, and they're active artists that create in flow, and as I was interviewing them, one of the interesting things that happened was that I found myself in a state of flow, asking them questions about flow. So we sort of created a bit of trio here where I was documenting them in their regular works and then also using some of my own interpretations to point them out the way I saw them through the interviews. What we get here is basically narratives that can be useful in the studies of happiness, treating people with depression, because what we get out of this is actually what helps people be in flow of happiness, and if we can interpret that into the works with some mentally handicapped people, well, that's the whole idea of feeling fantastic. And thank you very, very, very much. You could take a look at the works.
This one?
This one? Okay, so this guy is actually an acrobat. He works at the circus. And as I was interviewing him, he told me that he feels a bit contained in the circus. He only feels in flow when there's audience. He doesn't really, he doesn't engage in speech with them, but he engages, through the energy, through the ambience in the room. And so he really wanted to do something urban. He says that when he's in the city, when he sees people, he feels more in flow. So my interpretation was to take him to an urban space. And since he's already flying, we put on a bird mask here. And we let him be in the ports. And then we just used a little town inside of a shopping center. We just used a little water fountain over there. We got permission to basically give him a bird bath inside of the mall, inside the fountain. So he's having a bird bath over there. And of course, in my talks, I also show serious photos of them when they're actually practicing and doing their work. So this is sort of like a metaphor on what we're all doing here. Thank you so much.
So I'd like to welcome to Consciousness Central, Thomas Bever. Thomas is working in a field that is being explored at this year's TSC, which is the relationship between consciousness and linguistics. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you.
Could you introduce us to this or give us an outline into your research track towards consciousness and linguistics?
Okay. It's a rather new adventure for me because I'm primarily a linguist and what people call a psycholinguist. That is to say, I do research on how language behavior works, how language is acquired, what happens when you lose it because of some brain damage and things like that. But I have become interested in the issues relating to consciousness, and that's why I was invited to the conference, I guess. So my viewpoint, given what my skills are and what my interests have been, is to think about ways to use language as a tool to probe for how aspects of how consciousness works in its implementation, so to speak. So one of the things that language has, that language as we know it has underlying it, is a very complex set of operations. That's what linguists probe for and articulate. So even in the formation of a very simple sentence, there can, from a linguistic standpoint, be 50 or 100 different specific operations involved in creating the structure that at least the theory says underlies that relatively simple sentence. And that is completely unavailable to us, to our conscious. We have no direct awareness of all of these operations. But we do have lots and lots of different kinds of intuitions about sentences and language based on introspection. And in a sense, introspection is attempting to become conscious of something that's inside you. That's why it's called introspection. And so it's been, introspection as a concept has been in and out of cognitive sciences for a century or more, sometimes respectable and sometimes viewed as not respectable as a method. But it is a primary method that linguists use. So for linguists, the decision about whether a given sentence is grammatical or not grammatical, whether it is related to another sentence or not, and so on, these are all facts that are derived based on the intuitions of native speakers, and the intuition of a native speaker is basically rooted in that speaker introspecting about how he or she feels about that particular sentence. So the idea is that we now are in a position to use the different kinds of categories of formal operations that underlie a sentence as something to search for in relation to the particular kinds of intuitions about that sentence that we can have. And so it becomes a tool for exploring the relationship between what we can become conscious of and what the presumed unconscious structure is that underlies it. Okay, so that's one area of investigation. The second has to do with the variation in awareness or consciousness to external events, light flashes, in terms of experiments, arbitrary things like light flashes, clicks, tones, and so on, as a function of ongoing processing of language. So the goal of understanding sentences or understanding discourses is to map the acoustic stream onto words and meanings as closely in time as possible. And so it's like an ongoing race in which you are hearing a sequence of sounds and then quickly or ideally at the same time mapping what you're hearing onto meanings. Of course, with all of this unconscious kind of structuring that I've described earlier, presumably, and that's a scientific issue, presumably underlying what you're doing with a massive number of operations. Well, this means, not necessarily, but it turns out to be very useful and perhaps necessary, to chunk up the sequence that you hear. If you tried to understand the entire discourses without taking a breather to map individual pieces of it onto partial meanings, you'd run out of memory and probably out of patience. So, in fact, it is the case that one can demonstrate experimentally that as you listen to a sentence, you actually chunk it up, even if the speaker doesn't make it easy for you to do that. You, as a listener, chunk it up into units that are digestible, one after another. And a number of different kinds of studies have shown that at the end of each unit, something seems to be going on in which you're taking the acoustics that you've heard up to that time and the hypothesis that you've generated that goes along with that acoustic stream and actually mapping it onto your prior knowledge, onto the context that you're embedded in with a conversational partner or listening to a lecture or whatever it might be. And intuitively, these units are phrases, not surprising, because that's what we think of when we think of what a basic unit of compositional meaning is. It's a group of words that have been put together into a phrase. But there is now, as I say, there's evidence that at the end of each of these major chunks of mapping acoustics onto meaning, something happens with respect to your general mental openness, let's say. What happens seems to be the case that your mental work, rather than attending to the input, briefly attends to organizing the mental representation of what that input implies in relation to other representations, as I mentioned, your background knowledge, the current context being the most important. So that for about 1/10 of a second at the end of every major phrase, normally you are briefly deaf, blind, your haptic sensation or sensation is reduced, and ability to make discriminations of various kinds of sensory input is minimized for a very short period. I mean, it's so short that, of course, we don't really notice it. It's just a part of life. But then the question is, we have a situation then in which what we might as well call consciousness or awareness of the external world is briefly, in the extreme case, briefly cut off by the ongoing language processing. And so that raises the question as to, I mean, it's firstly an interesting phenomenon in its own right when you think about what consciousness is, that it really comes in chunks is a kind of interesting phenomenon. But it also raises the question as to whether there are many consciousnesses, one for each kind of modality, one for language, one for music, one for vision, looking around in the world and putting together the pieces that we see into something coherent. and so on, whether there's a family or a federation of consciousnesses, or whether there is one global consciousness that it essentially embraces everything when it can, and that language is just one of the kinds of activities or modalities that can temporarily co-opt this general consciousness and draw it away from everything else.
My understanding is that in the infant, the rapidly forming brain of the child, as they learn their native language, the learning mechanism is very different to later in life. Even a child of, say, 7 or 10, or as you said, 15, the method of learning is entirely different in the way that there's a short window, apparently, as my understanding is, if that's right, while language is learnt in a very natural, easy, kind of unstructured, but forms its own model. Whereas later you have to learn grammatical rules and vocabulary in a whole different way. Is this something, firstly, am I correct in saying that? And secondly, by looking at the infant brain developing, perhaps that gives us some interesting clues.
It's not clear that the child learns language. It's certainly not clear that the child is taught language. I think the metaphor or the analogy that is sometimes helpful to understand is how a child learns to walk. Why and how a child learns to walk. We know from feral children brought up by wolves or other animals, that if the child doesn't have an example of upright walking, the child may not develop it. So the child needs an example, needs adults around or older kids who are engaged in upright walking. But after that, who taught the child how to walk? Walk is organized falling. You're falling from one foot to the next. I mean, that's what walking is from a physicist standpoint. Well, nobody teaches a child that. The child has the neurological equipment to enact that, to respond to that physical law. And the child's motive may be to be able to be more mobile, but I think, frankly, that the child's motive is to be like the grown-ups. And I think that it's arguable that the same sort of capacity for language may be what is at issue. The child has a basic capacity for language, a basic structure that organizes how languages in general are. It needs the experience of being surrounded by some language, but after that, you don't teach. You may teach a 10-year-old what not to say or what to say, but you don't really teach a 2-year-old what to say or a 3-year-old what to say. You don't correct the child, or at least in many households, thank goodness, they don't correct the child. So the child has this capacity that's emerging, and I think a reasonable interpretation is not that the child is learning it, but that the child wants to be like the grown-ups and is using its innate equipment to actually organize its knowledge and its behavior so that it is increasingly like the grown-ups.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. With that, we're going to call it a day, but thank you so much, Tom, for coming, talking us today and mapping out the landscape there.
It's okay.
The relationship between linguistics and consciousness.
That's okay. I talk about talking for a living, so that's just
That's great. Okay. Thanks so much.
Okay.
Okay, Tom Bever. I'd like to welcome to Consciousness Central Bruce Damer. He's at the Biota Institute at UC Santa Cruz. Welcome, Bruce. Thank you for being with us this afternoon.
Yeah.
Your area of research and exploration is evolution of life, and with that obviously comes some sense of the evolution of consciousness as well. You're here presenting at the Science of Consciousness conference. What brings you here?
Stuart Hameroff brought me here.
Brunked you there.
Brunked me here. Last year they had Stuart Kaufman, who works on the origin of life from a theoretical basis, autocatalytic sets and things like that. And this year I'm coming to sort of fill that slot to talk about the actual physical mechanisms of the origin of life, and what that teaches us about all living systems, and then potentially what consciousness is. So it's kind of a big unwinding, because if you unwind life back to its bootstrap, its old computer bootstrap cycle, you can read the code of how life started and how it could have started up within the physical environment and the chemistry, the cycling body basically. And then that teaches you the properties of all living systems, including what the conscious field is, whatever it is. So that's what I'm doing here tomorrow, is to try to unravel that and present that as a new framework for them.
So this is a huge, monumental project, and a huge question for us as humans, as living beings on this planet, the mystery of it all. What can you tell us about that?
Well, one thing I have right here to ground us a little bit, this is it's a rock sample from the northwest of Australia, and it's one of the best preserved, it's really the oldest, best preserved evidence for life on Earth, 3.5 billion years old. And these little red nodules are called stromatolites. And they're biofilms laid down by early microbial communities that cement sand grains together. So this is our common ancestor. This is the unit that led to basically the entire biosphere. And this is at 3.5 billion years ago. The origin possibly was at 4.2, 4.3 billion years ago. That's the era that I work on, and there's no rock record. So these are complex little fellows. They're doing photosynthesis, they're doing chemosynthesis, probably thousands of species that made these structures. And then about 800 million years later, we find stromatolites at lake shores. So this is what's called lacustrine stromatolite, and these ridges here, those are made by living forms. And this is basically mudstone. You can almost even see it. So this is from the Tumbiana, also in Australia, and it's just basically a muddy lake shore. And you find a lot of these preserved from the marine seashore. So this is the whole story of life for about 90% of Earth's history. And we as complex life are extremely late in the game, and our bodies are almost like microbial mats, because our gut bacteria are 100 trillion of those versus 13 trillion cells. So we're mostly these biofilms. So the biofilm is the story of life on the planet. Complex life is a temporary interlude, probably 1 or 2% of the history of Earth, and then it'll go away. We're extraordinarily rare. So consciousness isn't a rare phenomenon, unless you believe consciousness can come out of these. So that's one piece of evidence that's come in, that life could have started in these hot spring environments or freshwater environments, not in the sea, not in the ocean, back in Darwin's warm little pond. So how does this roll forward, you may be asking? I'm
actually curious that how this is, just very simply, very quickly, how this is identified, how somebody can take a look at this and go, this is the very earliest life forms, and so we know this because.
We know this because what we see are these ridges, and geology can't make a structure like this. These ridges that pile up and go basically against the slumping forces of gravity. So it's made by active biofilms, and stromatolites still live today. And if you go to the coast of Australia or a number of places in saline environments, you can take old stromatolites and cut them in, and they look just like this. So these are their great ancestors.
How old again?
3.5 billion
3.5
years
billion
old.
years.
I'm on the one site selection team for the next Mars rover that'll be landing in 2021. And we're arguing, or we're debating with NASA to send the rover back to where a hot spring has been found to look for life on Mars there. But that's a little off topic from consciousness.
Maybe not, actually. Okay. Can we say, is it axiomatic that all things are descended from a single moment, a single molecular change in one local place, or is it?
That's where the new thinking is. The new thinking, and it does impact the study of consciousness. So what we're intuiting here, and we're starting to see in laboratory testing, is that the origin probably was not a single cell. It wasn't even a single process. It was a network effect. So in ponds that are drying down and wetting, that creates a pump action. That creates what's called a three-phase cycle. The universe does two-phase cycling. Stars are there, they blow up. Day-night cycles, things like that. The universe never has an intermediate phase, even in the quantum states. But life built an intermediate phase called bodies that have memory and adapt and evolve. And you're the intermediate phase between you and your children and your children's children, right? So in the earliest phase of life, you would have had a drying down pool with simple protocells all clumping together at the bottom, interacting with one another. And it's that matrix that's the whole is greater than the sum of the parts that creates the living world. And that goopy matrix actually is a probability machine. It's a probability engine that takes improbable events and makes them probable. It's almost a quantum kind of a thing. It takes things that are unlikely to happen in physics and makes them happen. I mean, us sitting here would never happen in physics in the universe, ever. Biology made this happen. So biology is a giant probability machine that makes things probable. And so somehow that property impacts the study of consciousness. Because if we say, for instance, we're doing a study where somebody has an intention for something, strong intention, I would like such and such to happen, and it does, but it's highly improbable. So the mystics among us might say there's an intersection of the angels. But if you understand the system of consciousness just as an outgrowth from life, that's a probability engine, well, of course, it has a mechanism by which even intention, human intention, affects that system in a way that it starts to bring improbable events your way, right? And the stepping stones are presented and such, because it's the property of all of life. So that's a sort of discovery of unwinding life to its basic source, what it does, what the trick that it does. It's still the thing that dominates our world. And so that's probably intention and serendipity. Coincidences are related to that because life also makes connections all over the place. It does a big connectome. Physics can't do that. The third thing it does is it creates memory. It creates instructions, genes, books, TV programs and interviews are the memory patternome, if you will. Physics doesn't do patternome, doesn't do linear information. So these three properties form a triangle. This is what I'll present for the first time tomorrow. It's never being presented, this idea that this triangle just continually cycles and it generates this incredibly large field that's called biology or the living world, but it's a field that's much larger than consciousness, much larger, and that a primate is an instrument into the field, sensing that field, but only through primate lenses. The earthworm will sense it through different lenses and have different objectives, but it will be affected probabilistically. It'll be affected by connections, and it has a memory, and it has a gene, or we have culture. So I think I will predict that there's nothing outside of that three-way triangle that just generates everything. So to understand consciousness, we have to understand its generating force, and that force generated a living world as well.
Something about hot springs, we were saying a bit earlier, there's something about the hot spring, that maybe the origin of life in a hot spring, and yet humans just love it, and primates
those
love
monkeys
it.
in Hokkaido.
Yes, exactly.
So if you have, what did the reductionist and what did the materialist and the spiritist do when they entered the hot spring? They became one ball of nerd woo.
Yes.
because they just soaked in, fell in love with each other, and it was all fine.
It's all fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all fine in the hot springs.
It's all
and now we know why.
And
That's where it all started.
Human beings evolved for hundreds of millions of years in order to invent the jacuzzi, to spread these jacuzzis all over the planet. And there's one out here in the hotel, a whirlpool, in order to raise our consciousness by lowering it, by relaxing.
That's all it took.
That's all it took. We have to go back to the hot springs, not the caves. The caves are over.
Right, it's the hot springs.
It's
That's
the
the
hot
key
springs.
to everything. The cave is a total diversion.
Yeah, the cave, we just did cave art. We argued about who had owned which part of the cave, but the hot spring, we come together.
Bruce, thank you very much for your time and for this. This is fascinating.
Thank you.
It's very nice to meet you.
Thank
and
you.
Thanks again.
Thank you
All
very
right,
much.
That's Bruce Damer. And that brings us to the end of this special bonus edition of Consciousness Central 2017. I hope you've enjoyed it. Be sure to join us next year, April 2018, when we return to Tucson for another Science of Consciousness conference. Until then, this is Nick Day saying thank you for watching and goodbye for now.